morning and welcome to our social stories video. My name is Shona Macpherson. I'm a speech and language therapist. I'm based in the Pines in Inverness, and I'm involved in delivering a variety of different types of training and workshops, including social stories. And I'll let my colleague introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Rachael Geddes. I'm the autism practitioner for the Child Health and Disability team, and I'm the coordinator for neurodevelopmental training across the Highland Council region. I regularly teach social stories with Shona.
So, for this training, we will look at what a social story is. We'll look at how to write a social story, and also, once you've written your story, how you present it to the child or the adult. So whose idea was social stories? Well, it was Carol Gray, who is an American. She was a teacher, and she was teaching in a school and was involved working with teenagers with autism. And she said the sort of light bulb moment for her came when one of her boys, called Eric, was in assembly. And in fact, every time he went to assembly, he ended up in an altercation with whoever it was that was delivering the assembly, and ended up having to be removed. Because every time whoever was at the front was speaking, Eric would interrupt and would talk back. So Carol sat down with Eric and asked him why he had to do this. And she very quickly realised that what Eric was doing was using the rules of conversation that Carol had taught him, which was one person speaks and then you reply. They speak and then it's your turn again. And he was doing this in assembly, but of course we know that that's not appropriate when you're in an audience. So Carol said her first social story was written to help Eric cope with assembly and use the correct rules. Carol Gray has written a number of books. She wrote the social story book, and this is now the new social story book, which has been rewritten. It's a nice resource to have. It's got a lot of information at the start about how you go about writing a social story, which Rachael and I are going to explain to you today. There are also templates for different social stories, which are useful. But of course, bear in mind that this is American. There's a lot of words like substitute teachers and recess. You would never just pull a story out of the book and use it. You would have to adapt it and alter it to be specific for the child or young person you're working with. But she wrote this. She also then wrote my social stories book, which is specifically for younger children. And there's nice little stories with cartoons on topics like how to brush your teeth, getting a haircut, going to bed, things like that. So that's my social stories book. She has also written comic strip conversations. Now this is a variation of a social story using cartoons and stick figures. So if you have somebody that likes comics, cartoons, then you can write a social story using the stick figures. She also has a colour code for the conversation that you have in the speech bubbles and the thought bubbles. So that red, if somebody's angry, you would colour it in red. If somebody's sad, you would colour it in blue. So that's a wee variation. You can have a look at that, comic strip conversations as well. So who are social stories for? Well, they're for all ages, from preschool children right up to adults. And you just adapt your story to the ability of the person you're writing it for. And they were written specifically for people with autism, but Carol Gray says they can be useful for people with learning difficulties, social communication difficulties, emotional difficulties. And in fact, we had a lady that came along to our training last year, and afterwards she came up to me and she said, my mother has Alzheimer's, and I think using social stories will really help her too. And I said, fantastic, of course they will. So, who are they for? Carol wrote the social stories with people with autism in mind because she was very aware that they have theory of mind difficulties and they have central coherence problems. And I'll pass over to Rachel, who's going to explain that.
Okay, so theory of mind. What is theory of mind? It's our ability to be able to see something from somebody else's perspective. So as we grow and develop, as a young child learns, they start to be able to see that somebody else thinks and feels differently to how they think and feel. Unfortunately, if you have a neurodevelopmental condition, this doesn't develop. You don't have a very strong theory of mind. So that means that you're then not able to put yourself into the position of other people around you. So from Eric's perspective, in the first story that Shona told you, he wouldn't have an awareness that that would be incredibly annoying for the person on the stage and incredibly distracting for the other kids around him, because he doesn't have that ability to think and feel what somebody else is experiencing in that situation. So therefore, we have to then do something to help Eric and the other children that we work with to think about things differently and to get the information in a different way, because they don't just pick it up. So it's also involved in recognising what is fact and what is fiction, knowing what is real and what is a belief. Kids on the spectrum and with other neurodevelopmental disabilities often really struggle to see people as being separate people to them, as having separate thoughts, hopes, beliefs. They often think that you know what is going on in their minds. They don't realise that your thoughts and feelings are different. And they're unable to read a situation and to realise that they're doing something wrong within that situation. As a neurotypical kid would learn that in the playground, what are the rules, what can I do, what can't I do? The child with a neurodevelopmental disability doesn't have the capacity to be able to do that. So to give you an example, imagine you'd been at work all day and your boss asked you to lead a presentation in the staff meeting at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So all of us could automatically think, right, okay, this is going to be tricky. Okay, so as you're presenting to this group, you can see that people are starting to nod off, that people are looking at the watches, that people are scratching their heads, maybe checking their phones. Somebody might have even nodded off. Or they're starting to fidget because they're really getting ready to go home. Your boss asks you to wrap it up. Okay, if we've got strong theory of minds, we can recognise those thoughts and feelings in other people. So I could see somebody looking at their watch and I would be able to think, oh, I need to start finishing this now because they're getting tired, it's been a long day, everybody's hot. We all want to get home. I'm going to keep this short and sweet and I'm going to get it over and done with. The person with a neurodevelopmental disability doesn't have that ability to read the situation that they're in. So may continue to the point where people are incredibly uncomfortable. So when the boss says wrap it up, I automatically know that that means I've got to bring it to an end. If you think about that from the perspective of a person with a neurodevelopmental disability, who things like idioms really don't mean a lot to them, if I say wrap it up, that implies that I'm needing to wrap something, as in a present. So communication is incredibly tricky for the people that we work with, and they're not able to read into things in the same way that we are able to read into things. So that's also linked really closely to weak central coherence. And this is about your inability to get the gist of the story. So if I walked into a room and there were lots of my colleagues around, I would be able to get the gist of what's happening and how it's happening, who's talking to who, whether it's a serious situation that people are talking about, or whether it's a staff meeting and people are just laughing and having a bit of a chat at the start of it. I can read that situation because I've got strong central coherence. If you don't have that, it's really difficult to be able to read that bigger picture. But however, if you've got a neurodevelopmental disability, you're often much better at reading the small bits. So your attention to detail, your ability to see things in the minutiae are far stronger than what mine would be. So if you think about those pictures where you're supposed to be able to find something such as where's Wally, I've got no hope because I'm really bad at things like that. Whereas a person with a neurodevelopmental disability might be able to find that really quickly because they're good at the really, really small detail. So what is a social story? What are we trying to do with a social story? So as I've already said, the kid in a playground will start to learn what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. What are the rules in this situation? How I can behave in the playground, is that different to how I behave in the classroom? How I behave in the classroom, is that different to how I behave in a PE lesson? And they'll start to learn those rules by watching other people and figuring out what is a good thing to do and what is a bad thing to do. When you've got a neurodevelopmental disability, your theory of mind's not there, you've got weak central coherence, that becomes a really massive struggle. And then you're not able to do these things. So the purpose of a social story is to teach that understanding and help that child to know what their actions and behaviour need to be in a certain social situation. What I'm not trying to do with a social story is dictate to a kid what they will do and what they won't do. I'm trying to teach why the behaviour needs to change and what the behaviour needs to change too. I'm not putting a set of rules on kids, and I am not teaching rote compliance. It should be really child-centred, the child should be involved in writing it, and it should be a really positive behavioural change, not you dictating what you think that behaviour should be. It should be really, really positive. So Carol Gray describes a social story as being a process in order to get a product. So the process is around thinking about what's happening with this child, why are they not understanding that social rule? So in the story of Eric, that Shona's already shared with you, she was talking about the rules of conversation, and Eric had misinterpreted the rule of conversation to a situation where that rule doesn't apply. A neurotypical kid would have picked that up. Somebody with a neurodevelopmental disability will not pick that up. So what we need to teach Eric is how you behave in different situations. So the process is figuring out, why is that kid doing that thing? What is it that we need to change? How do we involve that kid in that process so that they're with me and they're understanding where we're going? And at the end of that, I should then have my product, which is a social story that helps that child to understand why they're changing that behaviour, how they're changing that behaviour, and how pleased everybody will be if they try their hardest in order to be able to change.
Okay, so when and why to write social stories? Carol Gray says it's to give the person with autism the social information that they may be lacking, causing them to misread situations. So for example, a boy playing on his Xbox and his friend sitting beside him waiting for his turn. The boy's so engrossed in playing and enjoying his game, he's not able to read, because he's got autism, not able to read the non-verbal cues, the body language, that his friend is getting really fed up waiting. He's getting quite angry and frustrated because he wants his turn. A social story to help the boy learn to take turns and to share would be really useful. Also, to help describe a positive social behaviour. The whole point of a social story is to allow the person to understand what they can do to make a situation better for them. To be able to explain how it would benefit them is going to have a huge benefit and focus for them. So helping the child learn that to wait in turn rather than jumping to the front of the queue is going to make their friends happier and not make them frustrated because they're forever jumping ahead of them, is going to have a positive outcome. Also, to explain a new routine or situation. A lot of children and young people with autism get anxious about change and about new routines. So writing a social story about that. If you're going on a shopping trip, for example, for the first time, writing a social story about what's going to happen. Or if you're going out on a school trip, writing a social story in advance about the fact that there's going to be a bus, maybe, that you're going to be going on, and then you're going away somewhere. Having that story will help reduce the anxiety, help the child stay calm and know what's happening. And another reason you could write a social story is to help explain the difference between fact and fiction. A lot of young people with autism struggle to know the difference. So when they get involved in their Minecraft games or any of their other Xbox games, they can imagine or struggle to imagine that is not real, and they can take their experiences out into the playground and end up hurting other kids. Also, knowing what's imaginary and what's real can be difficult, for example, with things like fairies. I worked with a girl who believed in the tooth fairy because her mum had not only taken the tooth from underneath her pillow and left money, but she'd also written a note from the tooth fairy for the little girl. So of course the little girl believed that it was the fairy that had written the story. So she took her story into school and was showing it, took the note into school from the fairy, was telling all the children, I believe in fairies, here's my proof. And they all laughed at her. And they all said, fairies aren't real. So that was a distressing and upsetting situation, but we sat down, Mum and the girl and myself, and we wrote a social story, and we wrote about what's real, what's not real, and helped her to cope through that situation. Other possible topics for writing social stories? Well, at home you can write social stories about helping with social skills. For example, the boy with autism coming in and making a noise and interrupting his brother who's trying to get his homework done. And the boy doesn't realise that his brother's getting really annoyed with him. Writing a social story about that could help. About people and pets, maybe learning not to pull the cat's tail or not to pull too strongly on the dog's collar. Personal care, now that's a big one when kids are getting up into teenage years, learning to use deodorant, learning to have showers more regularly, and why that's important. Cooking and meal times, encouraging the young person to maybe take his dinner plate back through to the kitchen or help set the table. Outdoor games, well that's a biggie. A lot of kids with autism don't understand how to play imaginary games in the playground when the rules change every second turn. Also even playing a kickabout at football. The child might have learned what the rules of football are, but when it's a kickabout and you've just got a couple of jackets on the floor for goalposts and it's 5 against 4, you know, that's a completely different setup. Social stories can help with that. And also holidays. Going away to stay in a caravan for the first time, or going to a cottage, writing a story about what that's going to be like can be helpful. Thinking about stories in school, what kind of topics there? Well, unexpected changes in routine. Again, like I've said, that can cause huge anxieties. If, for example, your teacher's off ill, you can write a social story. In fact, Carol Gray has got template stories in the new social stories book about substitute teachers coming in, what to expect when that happens, or you know, if it's raining at playtime and you've got a wet playtime, what are the changes there. Transitions. A lot of people talk about transitions when you're transitioning from the end of one school year into another school year, or transitioning from primary school to secondary school. But you can have lots of transitions within a day, moving in and out of class, going from the cloakroom to the toilet, going from the toilet back to class, going from your class to another class if you're in different groups for maths or reading. All these transitions can be worrying for some children, so writing social stories about that and what's going to happen can be helpful. Also using appropriate language, again, not having that knowledge that maybe it's okay to swear in front of your friends out in the playground when there aren't adults around, but using that language in class is not appropriate. Saying these swear words to the head teacher is going to get you into trouble, so having social stories about that can be a very big help. I've mentioned taking turns and sharing as well. So how do we write the social story? Well, it's really important to picture your goal. The priority is to improve the understanding of the social situation, to explain to the child what they're doing wrong, to try to help them realise that by jumping ahead every time and getting in front of your friends is going to annoy them, it's going to make them angry. So taking your turn, maybe having a story about every Monday I can be first, other days I will be second, or maybe I'll go last, that kind of thing. It's important to share accurate social information, to explain to the child. Now that depends on the ability of the child. Some children may have a limited understanding, so you have to keep your story really simple so they understand. If you're working with an adult, you can go into much more detail, or an intelligent teenager, then you can share much more information with them. Describe rather than direct. Rachael has already said, we don't have a list of rules. You do this, you do this. You have to describe the situation, not direct them. And the result is to change the response of the person so that they have a much more positive and better social situation. So, gather all the information that you can. Observe the behaviour. So if something's happening, if they're getting into trouble in the playground, get out there, observe what's happening. And if there are other people involved, get the information from them. If there's other pupils, ask them, what's happening? Why is he getting upset? Why is he not understanding? Try to understand from the viewpoint of the child. Why is he doing that? What's the reason? What is he missing? What is he not understanding? And then talk through the situation with the child. That is really important. If they are verbal, if they have understanding, get them involved. It's their story and you're writing it for them. And then speak to as many other people that are involved as possible. Okay, over to Rachael.
Okay, so we have some guidelines of how you write a social story, and we will share those with you at the end of this film in links to documents that you can then read and work through with. Okay, so we break down social stories into different types of sentences. We have descriptive sentences, we have perspective sentences, directive and coaching sentences, affirmative sentences, and sometimes partial sentences. A directive or coaching sentence can be further broken down into sentences that direct and coach the individual, or direct and coach those that are working with the individual, or sentences that self-direct or coach the individual. I know sometimes when you look at these sentences, you can tie yourselves in knots and think, oh my goodness, where do I even start? Don't tie yourself in knots. It's really much simpler than it starts to appear. And once you've had a go at writing them, it really does become second nature. So don't worry about it too much. So a descriptive sentence, you are describing exactly what is happening in that situation. It's the backbone of the story. It's the what, why, when, who, and how. About what is happening, what is going wrong. So examples might be that you might start a social story with, my name is Fred and I go to Culbokie Primary. It's a factual sentence, it's a describing, it's starting to make that child an individual, that child knows that story is specifically about them. You might then add in a little bit about the situation where things are going wrong. So in this circumstance, we'll think about PE. So it might be, most Tuesdays we have PE. We're never going to say in a social story, always, because things change, things happen. And if people with neurodevelopmental disabilities are really literal, so if we say all the time, every Tuesday, then that starts to give a really literal interpretation. So we need to say most times we have PE on a Tuesday. Then we might start to say sometimes something else might happen. So sometimes PE might be in the hall, sometimes PE will be on the playground, sometimes PE will be on the field, because it would depend what sport you're playing, where you will be. Those are quite significant changes and transitions for a kid with a neurodevelopmental disability. So we have to be really careful that we're explaining all of the social information about that situation. So those are the sorts of things we would do in a descriptive sentence. Perspective sentence. So this is starting to put a bit of a thought and a feeling, an internal state of other people into this circumstance. We're starting to look at how other people might feel. So this is helping the child to understand the theory of mind of the other person and how their actions might impact on that other person. So it's starting to help them to see that they are different to the other person, and what they think and feel might not necessarily be what the other person thinks and feels. So examples might be, my sister usually enjoys sports. Okay, so I'm putting a bit of perspective into somebody else. Many people like to eat chocolate. Okay, so I'm describing a state or an emotion that another person might feel about something. It might be that I really, really dislike chocolate, and I might think that nobody should ever eat chocolate in my presence. I can remember working with a kid years ago who had an absolute aversion to Wotsits. So every time he saw a packet of Wotsits, he got really, really distressed. But all his classmates liked a Wotsit. So it was helping him to see that just because he didn't like something didn't mean that everybody else had got to change their behaviour. Another type of perspective sentence might be, sometimes mum does not feel well. Because it's really tricky when you've not got that theory of mind to understand that somebody else might be in pain, might be distressed, might be tired, and sometimes kids automatically feel that they've done something wrong because of how somebody else is behaving, when it might be that that person is just tired. So a directive or coaching sentences. These are starting to put in the thoughts of what needs to change. So I'm trying to get you to think in this social situation, what I'm going to do slightly differently. We don't use a huge amount of directive and coaching sentences because in one social story, we should only be trying to change one social behaviour. Okay? We're not going to change 5 things that are going wrong within one story. Potentially we're going to need to write 5 stories, but we're going to pick the thing that's most important to work on first, and when I'm using directive and coaching sentences, I'm going to keep those to a minimum because I'm only trying to change one thing at once, or it becomes utterly overwhelming. So the sorts of things I might do within this is, remember we said we're not doing the you will do this, you won't do that, these are the rules. So we're saying within a directive and coaching is, I will try to, I will work on. If we put a sentence into a social story that says, I will put my hand up every time I want to speak to the teacher. Who in life gets everything right all of the time? So then, if we're saying that I will do that every time, and then the child forgets to do that on one occasion, that could cause them great anxiety. So what we're saying within a social story is, I'm going to try my hardest, I'm going to do my best, I'm going to try and put my hand up. Yeah? We're not saying, we're not dictating that you will do it 100% of the time, because you are human and there are going to be times that you forget, you're excited, you want to tell the teacher something but it comes out of your mouth. I don't want you to get distressed about that, but I want you to learn that most of the time I'm going to try my hardest not to do that. Okay. So things I'm not going to say is Mrs. Smith will, Mum will, because again that's been very dictatorish. I'm going to say Mrs. Smith will try, Mum will try, because the child also needs to know that Mum and Mrs. Smith are not perfect. None of us get it right all of the time. So sentences that direct and coach the individual, a couple of examples might be, to help me to stay calm, I may try. Okay, so that might be, I may try to take some deep breaths. I might try to have a drink of water. I might try to go outside and have some fresh air. It might be about what I need to do if I'm becoming anxious within a situation. Because quite often, these kids who do have neurodevelopmental differences can get quite a lot of anxiety because everything around them is hard work. For us who are neurotypical, we go around the world and around our day-to-day and we understand what other people are thinking and feeling. We understand what the social rules are. And 99.9% of the time, we're going to get it right. Whereas for a child with a neurodevelopmental disability, they're not going to get it right all of the time. The anxiety is going to be higher than that of people without those sorts of differences. Or it might be, you might use a sentence such as, to help me to understand, I can put my hand up and ask the teacher. I can put my red slip on the table so the PSA knows that I need help. Because often we don't want to make ourselves stand out. Okay? So a partial sentence is slightly different, and this is when we're introducing a story to a child. We won't have partial sentences in. But when the child gets used to that story and they become really familiarised with what that story's saying, we might take the odd word out here and there to help them to then think about what is the missing word. That helps your memory to remember it and helps you to really ingrain that story in your mind. So we might use partial sentences with some kids. But remember what I've said, these details, these guidelines will all be at the end of the presentation for you to look at and for you to read through. So an affirmative sentence. This is a sentence which expresses a commonly held value or opinion. It's stressing what is the key thing of importance within that social situation in the environment that you're in. Because as we all know, environmental changes mean differences in behaviour. So how I behave on a weekend at home with my family will be different to how I behave at work. Equally, if I've gone out for a few cocktails with the girls, my behaviour will be slightly different again. So on a Saturday morning, I'll probably be found on the settee in my pyjamas with my kids. I'm clearly not going to come to work in my pyjamas and sit on the settee. Yeah? Nor am I going to wear my pyjamas out to have cocktails with the girls. So it's thinking about the changes in environment and how we change our behaviour to suit that environment and how we affirm that that is the right behaviour to be able to be doing. Okay, so things like, I will try to keep my seatbelt fastened. The affirmative would then be, this is really safe for me to do. So I'm reinforcing why that behaviour needs to change. So I had this situation a few years ago where a girl of around 10 was completely refusing to wear a seatbelt in the car. Mum and Dad had gone through it with her over and over again about why she needed to do it. And unfortunately, because lots of people with neurodevelopmental differences can't retain information over a long period, they had the same conversation every time they got in the car, which was incredibly frustrating for the whole family because she got quite distressed every time that this happened. So we wrote a social story explaining that it was the law, it was a rule, this was to keep her safe, and that this wasn't something that we were making her do. This was something that was for her safety, was for her protection, and that would keep her safe. Once she knew those rules, every time she then went to go on a car journey, she would read the social story before she went. She understood the rule, she complied with the rule. All of the anxiety was then taken out of the social situation because she knew what was happening and could understand why she needed to do it. Another thing that we encounter quite frequently is children experiencing distress in toilets because toilets are quite noisy. So when you flush a toilet, that gives a very unpredictable sound, and when you use a hand dryer in a toilet, that is also a very, very unpredictable, loud noise. But we can use a social story to just explain that that's perfectly normal, that that is what that piece of equipment does. It's not going to hurt you in any way, it's not going to leak on the floor or burn your hands or whatever it might be, that this is a very safe social situation. So ratios. Again, you can get yourself tied in knots with the ratios of what sentence you need to use, how many of this one, how many of the other one. Again, don't tie yourself in knots, because we just need to write very simply, very succinctly for the child that we're working with. So for a 5-year-old child, that might be different to a 15-year-old child. However, if that 15-year-old child had a learning disability and the 5-year-old didn't, it might be the opposite way round. So although we've got resources such as Carol Gray's books, lots of resources on the internet, lots of things you can Google and bring up different stories, lots of things on YouTube, what we have to really think about is that individual child and writing for that individual child. So when you first start out, it's great to look at examples in books or online, but what we need to do is write it about the specific person we're working with, and wherever possible we should be writing it with them, not for them. So when we think about the ratio of sentences, we can have an unlimited amount of descriptive, perspective and affirmative sentences. However, that doesn't mean I want you to write a novel. Social stories should be quite short, snappy, easy to read and not overly complicated. You should have no more than 2 directive coaching sentences. Yeah, and those 2 sentences should be about the same change in behaviour. Remember, we're not trying to change 5 different behaviours within one social story. That would be utterly overwhelming. And every social story should describe more than it directs, and the partial sentences would probably come in at a later date once the child has got used to that social story. You can start to phase certain words out to check that they've got that level of understanding. Okay, so Shona will just explain a situation. We've wrote the situation from a how not to do it to how you should do it, because believe me, we see a lot of ones that are very controlling, very directive, which we don't want. So Shona will give you this example.
Okay, so we have had a lot of teachers saying that it's often difficult when a child in their class is always shouting out. How can we help them know when to put their hand up instead of just shouting out, blurting out their answers? A lot of kids with neurodevelopmental difficulties struggle to hold on to that piece of information that they have in their heads. They just need to get it out. But that can be really frustrating for the teacher if she's explaining something or she's wanting other children to be involved in the conversation or the chat, and this one child's forever shouting out. So, putting your hand up in class we thought would be a good story title. How do you do it in a positive way? How do you do it in a negative way? How do you avoid doing it in a negative way? Well, we, excuse me, the first story we wrote is how not to write your social story. So our title was, I will not shout out in class. And we said, in school, I will listen to my teacher. Mrs. Smith gets angry when I shout out, and it's not fair to the rest of the children. I must not do this. I must put my hand up every time I want to speak. I will follow Mrs. Smith's golden rules, and then she will not get angry. Now I hope you are covering your ears and thinking, oh my word, that is such a negative story. Every single sentence that we put in there is how not to write a sentence. Let me share the positive angle on this. Our title now is Taking Turns to Speak in Class. Much more positive. My name is Tom and I am in Mrs. Smith's class. So immediately you've involved the child. He knows the stories about him and you're putting it in the first person, his name, where it's happening. I like to answer Mrs. Smith's questions. The other boys and girls in my class like to answer her questions too. It is important to take turns. So there's a social situation that the boy's not understanding. It's important to take turns. We can do this by putting our hand up and waiting for Mrs. Smith to ask us. I will try my hardest to remember to do this. So you're not saying he's going to do it every time. You're going to say he's going to try to do it. Mrs. Smith and my friends in class will be proud of me for trying, and Mrs. Smith will make sure I get a turn. And that's an affirming sentence at the end there to reassure Tom that yes, if he puts his hand up, she knows he's got something to say, she will get round to him. But other boys and girls will get their hands up too. They've got important things to say as well. So the whole story is very positive. It's centred around him. It's giving him the understanding and the opportunity to try this new way of speaking in class. So don't do the first one. Try and write your story in this way. Before it's over to you, but I just wanted to add in here another person that has written a book. In fact, she's written 4 books, and we have got a reading list at the end of our slides. Dr. Siobhan Timmins is a mum of a boy called Mark. Mark was diagnosed with autism, and Siobhan, the mum, has written a whole load of social stories from when Mark was little right up until he is now an adult. And her first book is for young children with autism. This one is for school and college students with autism, and then she's gone on to talk about adults and resilience as well in adult life. And what I was going to say, because it backs up what Rachel was saying earlier, is Siobhan used all of Carol Gray's techniques to write stories. One of the stories she wanted to write for Mark was how to ask for chill out time, because he was getting very distressed and uptight and needed to be able to calm down. But as she was writing the story, it was getting lengthier and lengthier and lengthier, and she realised that actually she had 3 stories that she had to write. She had to write a story to find out if he knew what calm down meant, because to ask for chill out time in order to calm down, how do you know when to ask for it if you don't know what calm means? So, and what does feeling calm mean? So she actually wrote 3 stories. First one was what is feeling calm, then she wrote what does calm down mean, and then she wrote how to ask for chill out time. So be aware that you don't write a novel, that if you have got a lot to say, split it, and that will help and make sure that the child knows what he's asking for and what the benefits are. Over to you.
Okay, so tailoring the social story. When I'm writing a social story, yes, I might look for ideas in some of these books or online, but then what I'm having to think is getting myself into that child's position, thinking about that individual child. So I might have 2 children that refuse to put their seatbelt on, but the social story for one child might be different to the social story for another child. So for instance, I had a 10-year-old with a really good level of understanding, but with an autistic spectrum condition, who wouldn't put a seatbelt on. I had a 7-year-old who's got autistic spectrum condition, he's got ADHD, he's got a learning disability. The social stories I wrote for those 2 children were very, very different, because they're very individual children. The reasons why they were doing things, what they were doing was different. Okay, so I can't just pick something out of a book and give it to a child. I've got to think about their individual circumstances. So the things I need to think about is their understanding of language. There's absolutely no point putting in words that they don't understand. I've got to think about their level of cognitive ability. Do they have a learning disability? Do they not? What is their age? What is their social level of understanding? I've got to think about their learning style. So for one child who's very, very able intelligently, I might use a lot of words. For another child who's struggling with literacy and numeracy, I might use a lot of pictures to explain the same sort of things, and I might just then put in a few words to back up the picture. So I'm thinking about that child as an individual and what they're likely to be able to understand. I need to think about their needs. I need to think about their interests. So sometimes I might put things in that are specifically about their interests. So a few years ago, I was working with a young man who had to take a number of different antibiotics for one single condition. And it was really difficult for him to understand why he'd got to take 3 different types of things. So his main interest was football, so I wrote 3 different social stories about 3 different antibiotics. One was a player, one was a coach, and one was the referee. They were all doing slightly different jobs. He could then understand that all of these people were needed in order to win this match, and he was able to then take the 3 different types of antibiotics. So sometimes we have to think outside the box a little bit, think a little bit differently of how I can help that child to understand. I need to think about their reading level, and I need to think about, will they need pictures, will they need words, how much detail can I put in, and what's their attention span. If you're not able to sit and listen to something that's quite involved, then there's no point in writing something that's quite involved. I've got to think about the attention span of that child. What will they manage? Well, I need to split it down into individual chunks, just as Siobhan Timmins did with regard to chill out, calm down, what do they even mean? Okay? So what I'm going to do when I write the story is I'm going to gather all of my information, and I'm going to write this story collaboratively with the child. I'm going to write it in the first person, and I'm going to help them to think about how they need to respond. I'm going to be really aware of literal interpretations, because if I put in something like "you will" or "PE always happens on a Tuesday afternoon," that can be taken extremely literally. And I'm going to translate abstract social information into really concrete information. So to give you another example, I worked with a 15-year-old boy who was using a lot of bad language. Okay? I know 15-year-old boys swear. I'm not going to write a social story that tells that 15-year-old boy that he can't swear, because that would make him stand out with his peer group more than if he did swear. So we had to write quite an involved piece of work. It took us quite a period of time where we had different social stories about different social situations. What words were acceptable, what words were not acceptable in different social places. So thinking about what he could and couldn't do in front of his 5-year-old brother, what he couldn't do within the classroom situation, what was acceptable within a playground situation, hanging about with his mates over the weekend, what was acceptable, and then also what was never acceptable. So some of the very, very offensive terms that he'd heard that would never be seen as being socially acceptable in any circumstance. That was quite an involved piece of work. Not, and then equally I could write a social story that's literally 4 sentences, helps that child to understand that social situation really quickly. So it depends on who you're working with, where you're working, and what their level of understanding is. So when I'm tailoring a social story text, I'm starting with a title. And a title gives an introduction as to what that social situation is. So it might be, in the car, I will try to wear my seatbelt. Or it might be, wearing a seatbelt in the car keeps me safe. It's giving an indication as to what is happening in that situation. It's reinforcing the most important information, and it defines what I'm trying to reach. What is my goal? Shona will give you a little bit more information now as to other things that we might include.
Thank you. The other good thing about having titles is when you've written a story and you've presented it and the child has learned that social situation and is ready to move on, don't ever bin your story, keep it. And then maybe in the next class they're in or in the next year, you might have to go back and look at it again. Having the title, you can quickly flick if you've got a folder full of your social stories. It's quite easy to be able to find the story you're after because you've got your title there. So, once you've written your story, you've had your chat with your young person, if that's possible, you've drafted it, you've added in your nice pictures, how do you present the story to the person? It's really important to find a nice quiet place. There's no point having a lot of background noise or loud music playing or the telly on or the whole box of toys out because they're going to be distracted. Find a nice quiet place so that they can focus on your new story for them. Sit beside the child. Don't sit face to face because we know a lot of kids with autism and those with neurodevelopmental difficulties can struggle to read facial expression, they can struggle to read body language. So if you remove that and just sit beside them, then that helps them just to focus on the story. I don't know if you've noticed even with young people, if you're driving in the car and you're well, I know with my teenagers, you know, there would be bolshy teenagers not really wanting to talk, getting out of the house, not a word said, you're sitting in the car, suddenly they'll start chatting because you've just removed that intensity of having to give eye contact and having to read facial expressions. You get a lot more from people if you're side by side. Interesting. Anyway, so sit beside them, explain the use of the story, say, remember we were talking about waiting in line, here's the story, I've put it together now, let's have a look at it. Read it through a few times so that they're familiar with it, and then share it with anyone else that's involved with the child in that situation. So if it's in the canteen, show it to the canteen staff, show it to the PSAs that are going to be there. If it's family, you're all going on holiday together, make sure every family member is aware so that they can be supporting the child too. Only introduce one story at a time. You may, as Rachael said, have a whole lot of things in your head that you're wanting to address. Only do one at a time or you're just going to confuse the child and maybe end up with failure. And don't be too adventurous, like we've said. Just keep it nice and simple, nice and straightforward, so that the hope is that you will meet with success easily. Reviewing the story. Read it once a day before the target situation. So if it's every time you're getting into the car, read it before you do that. If it's when they're about to go out into the playground, do it at playtime, do it again at lunchtime, do it every day before you go in. Be consistent in referring to it. If you forget, then how can you expect the child to remember to try and change their behaviour? You must be consistent, that's really important. And monitor the response. So if you can see that the child's behaviour is changing, that they are lining up, or that they are taking their turn, or that they are remembering not to swear, then check and see if the story is needed to be read again. Or if the child has completely internalised it and knows it, and before you even start, they're telling you what's in the story, then maybe you don't need to revise it. Maybe you need to put it into partial sentences, that's an option, or maybe you've cracked it. And then you can put that story away and move on to the next target. Don't, as I said before, ever bin a story though, because it may arise at another event or time. And yeah, always keep your story nice and visible and accessible for future use. So, Rachel?
It's your turn then. You get to write social stories now. So usually when we have a training group together, we encourage that training group to then write stories and we're able to go through with them. Obviously that's not an option at the moment, but what we're going to do is put loads of links on the Pines website to give you the guidelines, to give you some examples of good and bad, and have a crack at doing it yourself. So you need to sit with a colleague, or if you're a parent, you need to sit with another family member. You're going to choose a title for your social story. So I'd always advise that you just have some practice runs. Before you start working with the kids directly, have a crack at doing it. Go through them, draft out the social story using the guidelines that we're going to link you into, and then share your story with somebody else who can then say, oh, I like that bit, what about that bit, could you reword that bit? It always helps to have another person just to check it, to see whether they think you're on the right line. So that might be another colleague who's more experienced in writing social stories, or it might be if you're a parent, if you are currently working with an SLT or with a member of the Child Health and Disability team. We'll more than happily have a look at them for you and tell you where you've gone right and if you need to make any alterations. The more you write them, the easier it becomes. So I would say write them about anything and everything to start with. It could be about your husband having a bit of a fascination with loading the dishwasher in exactly the same way. Have some fun with it. Pick some daft situations within your own life that you think, right, okay, I could try out the principles of this, doing this in a different way. It helps you to feel a lot more comfortable with them, and it helps you to learn the rules of how you do them. You're thinking about your descriptive, your partial, your affirmative sentences, and how you're then going to put those into a clear and easy, understandable way. We have lots of fun with them, writing them for people's birthdays or retirement dues or whatever, sort of very sarcastic humour we tend to have in this place, and we will write social stories for each other, but it's because we just have loads and loads of practice and we just apply the same rules. So have some fun with them. Don't take it too seriously whilst you're learning how to put them together. Really, maybe write at least 5 or 10 before you start working with a child and just have a play with the structure and the processes. So sorts of titles you might use could be about waiting your turn, could be about walking along a corridor, could be what to do at wet playtimes, choosing a library book, lining up in order to get your lunch in the canteen, making mistakes in maths, and what to do when the teacher calls your name. Shona will give you some more examples.
Well, whatever the situation is that your child or young person is struggling with, you can write a social story about it. The important thing is to put it in their words so that they understand, they're involved, and they are getting help to improve and understand better, because life can be really hard for a lot of these kids with neurodevelopmental issues. I don't think I've ever had anyone ask me, could I write a story about this? And I've said no. I think in any situation, a social story could be a benefit. In fact, I had an email recently from a teacher asking for some help in writing a social story about a child who is struggling when the teacher gives somebody else a row in class. They think they're getting the row. Yes, a social story is going to help with that, absolutely. I had another one where the child was struggling to find a friend to play with in the playground. They were always on their own. They wanted to join in with the play, but they didn't know how to. Yes, a social story will help with that. Anything at all. Even, as you say, we were mentioning earlier, Siobhan Timmins has got loads and loads of examples of stories that she has actually written for Mark, which has helped him. Stories about spelling tests, stories about different teachers, stories about handwriting, about homework, about moving class, about break time, winning and losing, school events, noise. He was anxious about the fire drill. I've written a few stories about what to do when the fire alarm goes off, what happens then. The volume for headphones, what's the best volume for headphones? So, yes, social stories, I would say, are brilliant and can be used for anything.
The only time I've told a teacher not to write a social story was when she was telling me about a situation which the child was clearly distressed about, and I said, I don't want you to just change that behaviour, I want you to think about where that distress is coming from prior to getting into that social story, because if we're just changing the behaviour, we're not helping that child to move forward from what is anxiety causing. So it's, sometimes just pause and think, am I changing it for my benefit or their benefit? Is there something else going on behind this that I need to do a little bit more in-depth work with? So the NAS website is absolutely superb. So that's the National Autistic Society. They've got some brilliant guidelines on how to write a social story on that website, which we will give you the link to at the end of this film. We've also put together a reading list of all of the books that Shona's mentioned this morning. So again, that will be linked to the film, so you'll be able to have a look at that. A lot of these books, if you are in the Inverness area, we do have available for loan within the Pines Library. There are lots of things on the internet, there are a lot of things on YouTube. Look at those things, learn from those things, but then remember that you have to adapt it to the individual child. And we hope you have some fun with it, because social stories can be really, really beneficial for children. They can really help children to understand that social behaviour and to change something that they're not doing. We have to remember that these children are not doing these behaviours in order to be naughty. They don't understand the social rule, so therefore they can't abide to the social rule. So our job is to help them to understand it and to change that behaviour, not to dictate to them what they can and can't do with no explanation. Thank you for watching this film today. I will put all the slides onto the Pines website, the reading lists, and the links to the books that we have available in the library. Thank you very much.